All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to our next episode of cPDH.vibes. I am your host, BeachBodGod69, also known as Adam, along with my co-host, Ben, aka South Lakes Vibes. Ben, how is it going, sir?
I'm well. I'm thrilled to be back and recording again, using a new microphone, so it's going to be a little temperamental, but I'm optimistic. My week has been, for the most part, pretty decent, a little bit under the weather. Been catching a lot of PDH games where I can, getting clipped over and over again by Hollow Marauder. A lot of games going to time. No inferences intended to be drawn there. But yeah, just having a great time. How about you, Adam? What are you up to?
I'm doing good. I'm jealous of all the games you've had. I've not been able to get on one bit, and I'm getting withdrawals. I'm getting antsy. But what's funny is we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that might help you and other players today with when you actually start a game and you start playing in a pod. How do you really figure out? I mean, there's a lot of things that people are trying to figure out when it comes to threat assessment, where you're trying to figure out who I have to keep my eye on as we start the game. And so in today's session, we're going to take a little bit of a break from the data. I know our last episode was really data heavy, and we talked quite a bit about aggro. I thought it was awesome, but this is going to be more theory, and I think that it'll be a little bit refreshing. I want to talk about turn zero today, which is the concept that we've written on in cPDH.guide, and what it is the turn before the game starts is what I call it, turn zero. So talking about that, I'll just give like a quick definition, then we can talk about some of the points of turn zero today, and then we can certainly dive into perspective on some of those points, unless there's anything else that you wanted to cover today, Ben.
I think it sounds like a really fun little episode. So this is going to be a bit more lighthearted. It's going to be a bit more subjective. It's going to be more of an open discussion between Adam and I. We don't necessarily see eye to eye on every point on this topic, so it's going to be interesting to see what comes up. But yeah, Adam, I'll let you decide how we get into the discussion.
Well, why don't we start? Yeah, let's just define it real quick. So turn zero, I'm just going to define it as the time before the game starts, kind of like I said, where players send and receive messages before the game begins. So think about that. We're talking about people who sit down and are chit-chatting. There's no real clock that has started for the game yet. So this is like the one time throughout the game, 5-10 minutes, whatever, depending on the start time. In tournament settings, not as much, but this is where slow play rules don't apply. This is where you can just chit-chat away. And all of the things, all the messages that are sent at this time can communicate to you what is threatening. And I know it's like super meta, super heady, but it does have an impact. Like for example, seat position. We talked a little bit about that in our last episode, and we know that seat 1 is usually the most advantageous spot, right?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely.
So being able to see who's in each seat position, and the other bit of information that you're given is going to be, well, the pilot, right? Do you know the pilot? What kind of playstyle? Because I'll tell you right now, like Ben, you and I think we have relatively different playstyles. I mean, how would you describe yours? Would it be?
That's interesting. I guess it's entirely dependent on what you're piloting at the time. I guess I generally like to try and be a responsible player. I think there's, especially if you're in a later seat, it's generally better to try and hold up a mana infrequently while you try and develop your board unless you risk falling behind. But certainly, generally, I think towards seat turn 5 onwards, I like to have a piece of interaction in hand, and I build my decks around that premise, and I like to hold the mana open for it. But I know that you, Adam, take that to maybe a slightly greater extreme, and often are very happy to pass a turn without taking any actions if you think that it'll upset the balance of the game. And whilst I see that as advantageous, I know that for you, that's a kind of core heuristic you go to.
Yeah, because I mean, it's, inaction is its own action. I think that I tend to play when there's multiple opponents. I tend to, respect the space that we're all in and try to not splash too much, because if I become noisier than my neighbor, then all of a sudden I become more interesting than my neighbor. And I prefer players to be disinterested in me in a game, right? Then it's hard to know who the threat is if they're not interesting enough to pay attention to, for example. But that doesn't mean that you do nothing either, right? It's that balance. But in looking into that pilot reputation, I mean, there's others. Clay, for example, he really is a very aggressive, go after it kind of player. Another person that I think of who plays a classic strategy, Liam loves to play kind of that battle squadron, go wide aggro strategy in most of his decks. So if I see Liam at the table, and then I see the commander and the colors that he's playing, that's the other bit of information that we get right away, is what is the commander? What are the color pairings that I'm looking at? Or even just if I know that somebody shows up with Arabelle at the table, for example, that we talked about in our first episode, I know right off the bat that there's going to be damage spread across the board, and probably a third of the life total will be taken care of by Arabella, right? So no matter which seed order. And so decisions are the best made decisions, I would say, are made by informed decisions, right? Like you don't want to just fly blind in here. And getting this information off the bat, I think is really important. And I don't know, I mean, what are your takes on strategies and commanders? I mean, does the commander identity tend to lean to a strategy to you, or what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I think for the benefit of the listeners, it'd be good if we laid out roughly what the template you gave me for the conversation. So the first thing we were going to have a quick talk about is what we've already gotten into, is pilots and their reputations. You wanted to have a quick talk about seat position and the influence it has on the decisions you make. The commander and the colors used, and the implications that has for the kind of cards people might be running, what you think they might be looking to do in the game. The inference of strategies, strengths, and weaknesses based on what you think people are likely to be doing at the table and what you can leverage to your own advantage. The beginning of this ongoing conversation of what threat assessment means. And then your mulligans, of course, which is one of the most important things you can take information away from. It's what people kept. And then, of course, you wanted to close this discussion with your pet topic of potential alteration to the way that we play the game, which is this idea of maybe having a sideboard that we play at the start of the game. So I wanted to pick up on that point about pilots and their reputations. Look, it's not just about, you've played 100 games with the guy, so you know what cards he's like to be running, etc. There's a lot more to it that comes into it than that. People's reputation, the apparent skill level, is definitely something you factor in. It can make all sorts of bad, stinky vibes at the table if someone feels like you're targeting them without really understanding what they're doing. What I generally say is someone's skill level / reputation should be cause for you to allocate your attention to what they're doing. It's not an excuse for you to just blindly throw all of your interaction and damage at that player because you don't understand what they're up to. But it will infer how much of your energy you spend thinking about what they could be doing or what they might have in hand. Of course, in some cases, that's a trap, and the less you play, the less likely you are to know what it is you're looking at. But it's still, I think, relatively useful. Look, if somebody is very good at the game and has won a lot of tournaments, it's worth taking their position seriously, even if they apparently don't have anything in play. But the other component of that is politicking power. When you sit down and have opening discussions, you do the small talk with people while you're cutting and shuffling your deck and taking your opening mulligans. The attitudes people have at the table will infer who you think is going to be most profitable to engage with. If someone seems very nervous and they're gripping their cards, but otherwise friendly, maybe they are worried about feeling slightly embarrassed or like they don't know what they're doing. Maybe they need a little bit of help or encouragement. And maybe they might then be more receptive to suggestions you can make about deals you could cut between the two of you. Alternatively, if someone seems kind of relatively checked out and disinterested, maybe not a good point of investment of your time. And one third observation would be if somebody seems in a bad mood because something's gone poorly in their previous game, it's worth recognizing that person might be more sensitive to actions you take towards them and might be less inclined to keep a cool head and make decisions that lead to good outcomes for everybody at the table. So the way I tend to think about it is I tend to ask some opening questions about what people are playing. I throw some compliments around and I just get a vibe for how talkative people are. And if people are not interested in engaging in conversation, I know that they're either completely locked in and paying attention or that they're not having a good time. And those people generally are not worth your investment of effort. What are your thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, on that note, I mean, Be excellent to each other from Bill and Ted, right? Just be good to one another
Sure.
at the table. I think avoids a lot of those issues. But absolutely to your point, reading the temperament of each player will affect their decision making. If they're on tilt, I'm using a lot of poker terms here, but on tilt, or if they're not able. I mean, this game is chess and poker combined in a lot of it, and being able to read the room or read the pod is absolutely crucial, and context does matter. And sometimes, reading the pilot to that very first point. I remember that I was playing a game with Dave Alcadron, and his family, and his little brother was there at the table. He mentioned this on his podcast, and what it was is, through the mind and the lens of a 12-year-old, I'm going to attack you because I want to. It's not like a you're the threat. Sometimes that has its own impact, and you can eventually go into either intentional or unnatural king making in those circumstances, which is its own thing. But so reading the room, like you said, is key, and knowing your opponents well.
Absolutely.
I think is clutch.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we have a quick talk about seat position?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So with seat position, I mean, just recognizing right off the bat who has the privilege of seat one. Seat one privilege is a thing. It is a big deal, but also understanding. If you remember from our last episode, I believe it was seat 2 was the favorable position for certain archetypes. I think it was controller combo or both.
It's combo, yeah, absolutely.
Combo, yeah. So if you see Gretchen in seat 2 in your pod, or Weavers in seat 2 in your pod, that should be communicated right off the bat. Oh, we got combo in seat 2. In this turn 0 environment, we can start mentioning that. And even that one point, for if you have another pilot who's familiar with what that means, that isn't the ley lore player, that can impact the direction of the first 4 or 5 turns, right? Yeah, and where the gaze is.
Sure.
So
I mean, it's probably not actually how I'd advise someone to think about it. I think if you do throw out a statement like this player's in seat 2 and they're likely to win because combo wins in seat 2, I think you're quite likely to annoy whoever's having the finger pointed at them, because it is a bit of a fluffy statement. It's not that you're wrong by any means. I guess, again, it comes back to that same conversation of figuring out who you cut deals with. My read, or my guess, we didn't get into the data on why certain archetypes do well in different seats, but my general read is that in seat 1, people feel a lot more comfortable investing hard and gunning for the win with their advantageous seat position. And as a result, it can often lead to the player in seat 2 being the mouse who gets the second cheese and kind of scooping up the pieces when seat 1 gets stopped. Or just, as you point out, maybe inference that they just don't encounter so much attention. I think that across the course of the game, you should be looking to vocalize about what you think the balance of the game is, for 2 reasons. Actually, the first one is that it will make people more sympathetic to the decisions you make. It's less likely to create people feeling like they're being picked on, etc., if you can justify what you're doing. And secondly, because people do miss things, and including you. And if you outline that you think the game is in a certain position and someone corrects you, it's to your advantage. So I think being vocal about the game without munching people's time is useful. On seat position more broadly, I think there is a generally understand premise in the format that if you're in seat 4 in particular, but really seat 3 or 4, it is more justifiable for you to tap out more aggressively, at least through turns 1 through 4. Yes, people win in turns 1 and 2 all the time, but you are playing at a disadvantage, and everything you do will be at a disadvantage for the rest of the game. And it is important that you try and catch up. So it is a dice roll. But if you do want to be more greedy, I think generally there's more forgiveness at the table for that kind of behavior. But there is also an element of pragmatism. It may be that you want to invest hard to catch up, but you can clearly see plain as day that the guy in seat 1 or seat 2 has everything. And if the other people at the table aren't making noises like they're acknowledging that, or they're not holding up the mana, etc., maybe it's still to your interest to make that mana available, make that interaction available.
With mulligans, is actually one of the things that we mentioned on the list too, because you kind of touched on it slightly with cards in hand. All of these elements kind of interweave, right? So, and forget the pun, but like I'm gonna pick on Laylor Weaver because Bobby just absolutely swept a tournament. I mean, like 1 or 2 tournaments ago or something like that with Laylor, and that deck is the fastest glass cannon in the world as long as you have the right opening hand. And people leave you alone so you can get it done in the early game or the mid game. And seeing how aggressively a certain deck mulligans and the player's reaction to that mulligan, what I call mulligan aggression, matters. And I talk a little bit about this in the article, the early game article from a while ago, but a player might say, well, sitting back, they might say, this hand will do, this is great. That is displaying strength. Now, are they bluffing? Sure. Or if you see Laylor, Clay, when piloting that, I remember he told me that he'll even go down to 4 cards as long as he gets his key components in. Yeah. And so if you see a combo deck or a notorious, Simic combo deck aggressively mulliganing, they're probably looking for it's a very turnkey strategy that they're probably employing of trying to get that combo out as quickly as possible. So do I need to also mulligan for that one Stone Rain type card to get rid of, or that Boomerang to get rid of that land to slow them down in 100%. Order to...
Yeah, so and you also got to pay attention to the noises coming from that side of the table. Like people often do this kind of hyper dramatic, woe is me, my hand is so terrible, here I go to 5 cards thing. Or in the case where they kept 7, they'll keep talking about how terrible their opening 7 was as they proceed to pop off and develop an almost unchallengeable board state. I think you just have to kind of read the room. You get a vibe on what that person's actually doing. If that person's making a noise about their bad luck, but their body language or their opening turn doesn't suggest that they've had a particularly bad hand, take it with a pinch of salt. By extension, if that person seems genuinely morose or frustrated, maybe it is the case that they've had some mulligan to 5 because they saw no lands, etc. And maybe you have a bit more breathing room, in which case it might be worth paying attention to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to that end, I don't know how many times I played against a Gretchen player that says, well, I got nothing. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll pick on I haven't seen Ryan play in a long time. Do miss him, but I remember he's the king of, man, I am just sunk here. How many times have we'll be saying I can't do anything, or even if they have a full grip of cards, and throughout the game players are saying, I wish I had interaction. I'm like, come on, you've got to have something. You're just holding it up for yourself. Right?
Sure.
Yeah. So
drifting away a little bit from our turn 0 discussion, but yeah, more broadly, a lot of this is just stuff Adam and I picked up across the course of the time we're here. And again, look, if you are in a lower seat, if you are in a higher seat, there are implications for how people see you at the table. And it may be, especially if you're playing a deck that isn't capable of going as fast, that you want to make that clear to other people, that people don't need to pay an abnormal amount of attention to you just because you're in an earlier seat, because you're not going to present threat so early. If you do present threat very early, maybe it's worth shutting up and not saying too much in case you doth protest too much and people infer that you might actually have something really scary. So a lot of this just comes with practice. I don't think either Adam or I claim to be kind of experts in how to deal with it, but it is something we've noticed a lot. It has a massive implication for how people behave at the table, and it's worth thinking about the psychology of someone in seat 4. If you're constantly asking them, for example, can you hold up interaction on this turn? Eventually they're going to refuse because they need to get into the game. Likewise in seat 1, if you're trying to convince them that the player in seat 3 is a threat, well, the player in seat 1 might be thinking, well, I'm just going to erase them and win anyway. So again, use this to inform where you choose to spend your political energy at the table, I think is what we're trying to drive at.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you for bringing us back with that, because that's just it. It's how do you spend your resources, and being your words, consider them a finite resource as well. Sure. I mean, this is going slightly beyond the term 0 concept, but moving more into negotiation, which we should spend an episode on. But
sure.
If you're talking all the time and politicking all the time, people are just going to get irritated with you.
100%. It's terrible. No one likes the guy who's ironic, but no one likes the guy who's constantly yapping on and cutting other people up and making distress noises when someone else resolves any spell of any significance. There is a boy who cries wolf thing here. the other thing I would say in general is when you are making offers, it really is important to make it clear to the other person that this is mutually beneficial. Saying generic things like "please don't target my stuff" or "oh, I won't do anything to you," etc. It's just not going to cut it. You need to give them an apparent path forward. And if it is the before the game even starts, and you decide you want to make that offer to them, you need to show them that you're aware of what their deck actually does. You can't just say, well, if you hold up interaction, and then I'll invest for you, or likewise. If their deck doesn't run a lot of interaction, or if their deck is trying to storm off as soon as possible, or if their deck can't pressure someone with their life total, etc., there's a finite amount of value to you making those kind of deals. So you need to pay attention to what the commanders are that people are playing, which brings us into our next point. And you need to pay attention to what that person is likely to be interested in based on their apparent game plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And that game plan, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it can be this conversation, and it's something that I don't think people even recognize or realize is happening, but it's happening in every single game, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And so what the purpose of this is really just to make everybody aware of, what these micro transactions, these micro messages mean, and what they could end up relaying to one another. When you're saying, well, this is actually a brand new brew, so I'm not sure how well it's going to do,
right,
is displaying like that message is saying, I'm in a weaker position than you think I am.
100%.
Right, so I'm trying to sell that message to somebody.
And there's also definitely likely to annoy someone at a tournament if you tell them that you haven't properly tested or optimized whatever it is you bought. So expect to be taken less seriously if you're going to try and play possum, I believe is the expression.
Yeah, and most of the time, I've gotten to this point where I think, okay, why are they doing this already? For example, like, why are they already saying I am in a position of weakness?
100%.
Does that mean that they actually have strength that they're not trying to show, or are they truly being honest? How do I gauge that?
And it comes back to the same point you made about this idea of having a budget for how much you can actually speak at the table. Mm-hmm. Imagine that, what would be an obnoxious amount of posturing that you could do if you're making one broad assessment or offer per turn cycle. Eventually people are going to get fed up, so let's assume that you can make one offer every 2 turn cycles. Let's say the game goes 10 turns, that's 5 offers or 5 observations you can make in the course of the game. Do you really want to burn them all protesting about how poorly you are or how few resources you've got?
Yeah, I know that I would not ever want to become that noisy voice at the table, because then all of a sudden, usually that person, that player, inevitably becomes the thing that needs to be removed.
Oh, right? Well, eventually people just become disinterested, whatever you're offering. Let's move on to our next point, because you've written here commander and colors used. I'm particularly intrigued by the idea of the colors used. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so the colors used, I think, give an inference on the strategies. Like, if somebody's running a mono black build, more than likely Gary will be in it. More than likely edicts will be a part of the strategy. And so knowing that that's just what has worked well, I have to always make sure that we look at a life total, and if that player's life total is low, they're going to be searching for a Gary to come back into it, right?
100%,
so
sure.
That's just a quick example. I think another example is if somebody is playing red, they will most likely have pingers in the build.
Or they'll be very aggressive, and it should be relatively self-evident what they're trying to do based on the commander,
exactly.
Right? Yeah. I think this point is actually very pertinent, because I think this is most relevant where you don't know what the commander or the deck is supposed to be doing. Sometimes people will be relaxed enough that they'll give you an idea of how their deck is supposed to play. They might even use that as to their advantage to try and dissuade some tension. People bringing a completely unknown pile to a table can often receive more attention than they'd like, because people don't understand how they're supposed to project at the subsequent turns. But most of the time, people aren't going to sit down and lay out every combo line that they have available and how they like to get there, and the tech pieces they use to recover from difficult situations. So the colors are actually a reasonably useful source of information. Again, we are at common rarity, so there is a restriction on what different colors of cards can do. If that person is playing a green deck and it doesn't have access to apparent draw power through green or black, they probably have a finite amount of card advantage, and you can use that to infer how well they can recover from a board wipe, how well they can recover from repeated pieces of interaction, etc. If somebody's playing a white deck, you know that they probably have some capacity to gain life. White has an enormous number of tools that unconditionally say no more, here is some life, including some big splashy ones like Congregate. And putting aside niche cases like Miskopa Guildmage, where you can turn it into an offensive tool, you can infer that that person in general might be able to recover from an otherwise unrecoverable position. And you might need to think, okay, I'm assuming this person can be left alone this turn because they're probably going to die in the turn cycle. If that person's playing white, maybe it's not the case. And if you're playing an aggressive deck, maybe you might want to look in that direction. And again, it's like a tertiary consideration, in my view, for thinking about how you assess threat at the table. But if you really have nothing to go on and you've never seen the commander before, you've got no idea from the commander's apparent abilities what they're looking to do. Someone's playing Anorami or something, and you recognize that they're encoring creatures, but you've got no idea what kind of creatures are encoring. You look at the colors and infer, okay, this person might have access to board wipes. That's a problem for me. This person might have access to fogs. They might have access to tutors to go and find specific pieces. And if you're in a pinch, I would say that that's a credible way of thinking about who you target as a turn 0 action.
Yeah, and when we say target, I want to be very clear. Please don't feel targeted, anyone. But I mean, it's understanding who will potentially be my greatest threat, and it's not necessarily who I need to go after in directly. Sometimes it is, but it's who do I need to pay attention to. And if my attention is primarily at, let's say I'm in seat 3, and seat 1 is my, for whatever reason, the person I've identified. I'm not losing focus on 4 or 3 or 4 or 2, right? I'm not losing my focus on what they're doing. It's what am I paying attention to? How do I lightly influence, kind of disrupt in a way lightly what's going on against that opponent, if that's the number one quote unquote threat to me at this time. But it doesn't mean that you're going after. I mean, you got to think of it in a very diplomatic way.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, again, it's probably slightly sloppy wording on my part. Again, you should be paying attention to as many actions at the table as possible. In fact, as we move on from this, Adam, I'd like to actually inject my own note here, or like mini subtopic, which is what you do to prepare yourself for the upcoming game. So I'm interested to hear how you play. If it's not really late, and I'm not struggling for amount of energy, etc. The way I tend to like to play games is to keep a notepad or a note file open on my PC if I'm playing online. And on that notepad, I tend to record the following. So it'll normally be a running count of cards in hand per player, so that I don't have to ask every single turn. I will typically check every 2 turns, let's say, anyway, just to make sure I'm accurate. It'll typically be the amount of mana someone has available. And also any cards or information they revealed I might need to pay special attention to. So let's say that someone's, again, they're playing Malcolm Kedis. Someone has shown me that Merchant Scroll to get a Trickery Charm or something. Well, now I know that they have one piece of the combo. And so I make a note saying what other piece they need to have so I can pay attention to what they resolve in subsequent turns. That might be an excessive amount of work for you when you are trying to play out the early turns of the game. It can be hard to maintain. But I tend to find that not only does it mean that I make fewer whoopsies, but it also means that I keep track of things and notice things I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I think the practice of keeping yourself forcibly engaged keeps you awake, stops you from tunnel visioning on your own win condition. And also, again, affords you more political power, because if you can give accurate and meaningful observations about the state of the game to people are more likely to be interested in your assessment. If you're just kind of making groaning noises whenever a combo piece emerges, people are going to be less interested in what you do. Do you have any note-taking you do during games, Adam? Is there any process checkpoints you take to keep track of what's happening? Or
yeah, and I do. I'll use, I mean, if I'm in an in-person tournament or in anything like that, I mean, usually I'll bring a notepad. I might write some things down. But when it comes to online, often I'll use the chat feature on Spell Table where you can type in a card, that kind of thing. But I also play Glasses of Urza often in my deck, so that way I can have communal knowledge for people saying, hey, look, this is in hand, just so everybody knows. Not over using that those tools though is tricky, but I definitely I use whatever information I can as I'm piloting in order to make informed decisions and to help others do the same. So, but those would be the tools that I use. So I use
Makes
my
sense,
words,
sure.
yeah, all that good stuff.
Glasses of Urza is a funny card. I think the hand visibility stuff people use at Git Probe and Peak, etc., do present like an interesting additional consideration at the table, because you don't tend to think about them when you're building your deck. The idea that somebody can see what you've got in hand at any given moment doesn't tend to crop up, and it does change the flavor of the game significantly. And there's a huge amount to be said about what you do once you've got that information, which again we can talk about in another episode. But yeah, it is worth thinking when you're brewing your deck, if you're concerned about you maybe having quite a flippy proposition where it's a coin flip, maybe sometimes it can go your way if you make a certain call or not. Maybe you're running an abnormal amount of sorcery speed interaction because it just happens to benefit whatever you're doing, for example. Having access to tools that grant you hand information might be a way of easing that burden. Of course, there's an opportunity cost with everything you include, but it is interesting to think about bringing your deck around the idea of acquiring extra political power at the table if that's something that you enjoy.
100%. 100%.
Should we move on to our next point then? So you talked here about inference of strategies, strengths, and weaknesses. You want to talk to me about what you had in mind when you wrote that down?
Yeah, this is actually, we had a conversation about this not too long ago, Ben and I think Clay and some of the others were a part of it too, where if you're playing a deck that is truly completely designed to aggro your opponent in the table, accepting the weakness of that deck, where it's designed to rush the opponent with damage as quickly as possible, it could have a glass cannon effect, or like we talked about ley lore, for example. You're trying to quickly rush as fast as possible, and there will be a window. I think Abdel Blue always had this too. I mean, it's a little bit better now than it used to be, but there was always like a certain window where you could interact with it. And, understanding your opponent's weaknesses and your own weaknesses, I think are clutch in order to be successful. And having that inference of strategy, like we talked about, where like if someone runs Alexios, for example, I know right off the bat the dynamic of the game is going to be very different with that strategy than if it was going to be Arami, where Arami is going to be more explosive with graveyard interaction and so forth. So seeing the commander and the inference of strategies and understanding some of the weaknesses of those decks, I think is going to be important. The more familiar you are with the meta and the format, I think the better and the more skillful everyone's going to be here.
I think that's all very reasonable observations. I definitely also think there's something to be said for, again, if you don't understand what someone's deck does, there is an argument that you just ask, and you ask the other players at the table. Again, you're constantly walking a fine line with not wanting to annoy people so much that they either refuse to play with you or they tell other people to not interact with you. But it is worth noting that if you do ask people, what normally happens is you will find out. There will normally be someone experienced at the table who can tell you what that player is trying to do. And it also reinforces in those other people's minds what they're supposed to be looking out for. Sometimes people can get interested in what their own deck is supposed to be trying to do at one point in time, and they can forget what they're supposed to be looking for. And if you aren't sure when these certain breakpoints occur, and I think your point about being certain points of interaction, etc., Adam, is really, really important to bear in mind, you can just ask. If people snap at you, etc., then again, you can take that up with them after the game, etc. It's not something that everyone's comfortable doing, but generally speaking, people are pretty comfortable helping new players get into the format, and everybody starts somewhere. So if you feel uncomfortable or uncertain at any point, it's always a good idea to ask. On that point about the differences in clock, etc., and what people like to be doing, I think that a lot of it's kind of self-evident. Sometimes you don't necessarily know how fast someone's deck can be, but again, based on the colors, based on the commander, you can normally make a logical inference. One thing I think is really important is to think about people's shared incentives and what they're likely to agree with you to do. If you're sitting down at the table and you're playing a combat deck and the other three players playing combo decks, you could sit there and demand of the aggression player all they want that they swing their dorks at the Malcolm player or whatever. They're not going to engage in that because it's just not a credible access for them to win the game. Even if, from your perspective, if they were doing it, it would help you get the threat off the table. Likewise, it might be the case you sit down and think, wow, this Dargo Kedis deck is going to be really useful for me for taking out certain players. And it's like, yeah, but it's also going to take most of your health bar with it. And so you have to make a decision about what you're willing to put up with. I mean, maybe that player won't be interested in working with you at all because they're not interested in working with anyone. They just want everybody gone. And then, of course, if you are making deals with people and you're making assessments on what people are good at and bad at, you have to recognize that they're playing the deck for a reason. If you sit down and decide, for example, that the Cutsil player is doing enough similar stuff to your, I don't know, Stormclaw Razor list in terms of smacking people and attrition and overwhelming people with card advantage, you've got to recognize that you're facilitating them getting ahead as well. And so you have to figure out at what point you try and put yourself in a stronger position than that player. And so this is kind of an infinite conversation, and it's like a how long is a piece of string conversation. There's always more you can do to optimize your position. And there's always more you can do to have more sophisticated and beneficial discussions with other people. And so some of this is just practicing. The other thing I would note just before we move on is you have to try and stick to deals if you make them. This is one of the biggest problems I have as a player, is that I'll make deals that I think reflect what I'm looking to do at the table. And 3 turns later, I'll have completely forgotten I made them. And you tend to get a very angry squawk from the other side of the table when you accidentally go back on your deal, whether you then choose to accept that it was a mistake and retract the action or whatever. But you need to figure out what you're actually prepared to commit to. And if it's right at the start of the game, you need to be very careful about not overcommitting to a single player and offering yourself up as an ally, because it might be that they're more explosive than you realized and you might have facilitated them getting well ahead of you.
Yeah, and I think if you ever watch, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably watched the Command Zone once or twice in your lifetime, where Josh Lee Kwai and he's actually very good at this, where Jimmy Wong too, but Josh Lee Kwai will always negotiate, like he's actively negotiating at the table, but the main thing is honoring those commitments is huge. And it's, I mean, we all forget, it's fine, but like if you're chronically forgetting, it's at a point where it's like, all right, you are a forgetful, unreliable, you know, that's your reputation, and that's the reputation you do not want at the table, because so much, even though we've only really talked about, you know, the verbal communication of negotiating at the table, and this again goes a little bit beyond turn 0, but as you play your games, turn 0, that your reputation sticks with you, right? And that nonverbal communication of your presence is its own thing. And I did mention in one of the articles here, like there are some classic bluffs that people can use as they're playing to keep in mind too, even not acting, like you said before, like the draw go, leaving mana up for interaction. It could be a simple bluff in a grip of 5 cards that I've got a piece of interaction, or I simply don't, and I just don't want to provoke anything, right? So seeing how people have interacted in the past, to Ben's point, I think affects some of that decision making and the reputation that players have and pilots have in turn 0. So definitely an important thing to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And I think as we've gone along with what we've realized is that whilst we're presenting these points individually as points of conversation, they all overlap and intertwine with each other. You know, you can't pick one and decide you're going to do one more than the other, etc. It needs to be a holistic picture of figuring out all of this. And a lot of that just comes with practice and time. After a while, you start to recognize roughly what you're looking at, and you get a gut feel for how you interact at the table and what you plan to do. So, did you want to have a conversation about this next bullet point, where you've written ongoing conversation about threat assessment, or do you feel that we've adequately covered that?
I think that we've covered it well. I mean, the one thing that I would add to our conversation, though, is adding agency to the time spent in turn 0 for players, not just in, you know, communicating, sending, receiving messages, but also having agency that tangibly affects your deck build. And that's where I bring up this topic of suggesting that we bring back an old Commander classic that used to exist in the EDH format back when, I guess they call it pre-DH now, but there was a 10-card sideboard that existed back in the day. And it was used primarily as a wish board, you know, when people play, you know, Death Wish, Burning Wish, Living Wish, those wishes, right? And they would use that to extend the size of the deck and to also have a little bit more, you can't remove this with Bitter Ordeal or Extract kind of defending the space of those key cards. I think that where I used it in the past, and where so many skillful players used it in the past when you were playing in pods, is we would all sit down, reveal the commanders, and chit chat. But I can see that you're playing a graveyard based deck. I'm gonna have to side for that because I don't have a bunch of stuff.
Understood. So before we jump into that, let's touch on our last bullet point then about mulligan aggression, because I think that the sideboard conversation is both interesting and obviously a huge pet interest of yours. So I want to allocate proper time for that. Should we just make a quick note about, I think you've talked about how aggressively people mulligan in games in general, but what are you doing when you're mulliganing in your opening hands, and what information from the table are you taking as to whether or not you keep a hand?
Okay. Yeah. So in mulligan aggression, what I'm looking at, number one, is I'm looking for player reaction or lack of reaction, and I'm trying to read based off of the information that I have from the color combination and the commander as I've read them, and the inference of the strategy. So all of this kind of leads up to, okay, how are they mulliganing? And some of it's just luck. Some of it is, I didn't get any lands. Or the 4 lands doesn't work for this deck, right? Those aren't dismissible, but they aren't as telling, for example. So if I'm like mulliganing on the defense, I might even infer, no lands, gotta switch this up or whatever. And then that's kind of like a catch-all why someone would mulligan. But as I'm paying attention to the language of people or even the strategy of people, one very clear example of an aggressive mulligan deck that we talked about before was Laylor, right? Laylor Weaver will go down to even 3 cards if it gets that key, freed from the reel and untapper and land aura, whatever, right? That they need, and or even just something that will get those key components. And knowing how quick that deck is, if I'm playing removal that can target their land, like if I don't have a boomerang in hand and I'm playing blue, or a counterspell and I'm playing blue, something to remove that quickly, I'm going to mulligan until I get the answer to that deck, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And by extension, to avoid tunnel visioning on the same deck, there's all kinds of interaction are effective against different kinds of decks. I tend to run a lot of bounce spells if I'm in blue because they're extremely cheap and they're instant speed, and they can also protect your stuff. I think they do just about enough. But they're terrible to flicker combo, which is one of the most common forms of flicker combo interaction in the game, and they buy you time more so than removing a threat permanently. And so you have to think about what it is you're actually mulliganing for in your opener. You have to think about when I'm saying I'm looking for a piece of interaction, does it actually fit what's happening at the table? And maybe, again, if you're looking to win the game slightly faster, you're mulliganing for a win line or opening pieces. But even then, if you're looking at a hand and you've got 2 combo pieces, but they do absolutely nothing for your opening curve, they do nothing to acquire an advantage, is it actually worth keeping the hand? You have to recognize then that there's probably a period of time where you're sitting with those pieces, unable to resolve them because it puts a target in your head without you being able to actually close the game and capitalize on having them. So I think you need to be realistic about what your hand ought to look like and what needs to happen at the table. You need a certain number of lands or a certain number of mana sources to be able to get online. In some cases, fast mana like Lotus Petal or a ritual otherwise might be appropriate if you think that you can leverage that into aggressive advantage. But then, of course, there's a risk associated with doing so. People can blow you out because they worry that you've had apparently such a strong opener, and now you don't have any additional mana to do anything. In the most recent tournament, we saw OMG Chris I don't think he kept a bad hand at all. I can't remember if he kept fast mana or not, but he played a Malcolm in seat 1 on turn 3, etc. And then I think Clay bolted it in the same turn cycle, and it very possibly denied him the win in the game altogether because it time walked him so hard. And so you need to think about how other people at the table are perceiving your position and what you're likely to be doing over the subsequent turns. Bear in mind, by turn 3, turn 4, you're going to have seen a minimum of 10 or 11 cards if you kept your opening 7. What do you expect on average to be seeing in those cards? Are you likely to, if you're keeping 2 lands, how likely is it that you see your third? And in most cases, most decks do need a third in order to operate. If you're keeping an opening hand with multiple pieces of interaction, but it doesn't have any way to accentuate your game plan, no matter how appropriate that interaction might be for the game, is the cost to your actual curve and your ability to get online worth being able to answer those threats intermittently? And what happens if those threats your attempts to interact are stuffed, I mean, how screwed are you in that position? And so there's a discussion, I think, about recognizing that every single time you mulligan, you're likely to go down by a card outside of your free opening mulligan. And each time, therefore, there's an opportunity cost associated with it. And you need to think really hard about how have I built my deck in such a way that I can cope with a more mediocre opening hand? Am I confident I'll see answers this turning up? And if you're finding consistently that your mulligans are determining the outcome of the game, there is a good argument, in my view, and it's a little bit controversial, but that you should go back and take a good hard look at your list, because this is an element of the game that is truly outside of your control. So with all of that said, shall we jump into the discussion about what I know you really wanted to talk about this whole time, which is the idea of having an X card sideboard in PDH games going forward?
Yeah, I think that for at least in the competitive space, I think that it would add a great deal of agency to players that are in the pod to take advantage of the foreknowledge of turn zero and to be able to have that become its own component within piloting. It puts a lot more, I would say, freedom, a lot more, like I said, agency, but I think also responsibility on the players to know what is going on in the meta and how we can respond to that. And it adds its own, like we call it 4D chess element of the game, which I know that a lot of the very competitive players, myself included, are all about. But what I'm really excited about is eventually when people start bluffing that they're even sideboarding when they're not, and how that could even impact. So I mean, there's so much.
Let's jump on that point there, because I think it's really important that we outline the terms. What are you proposing, or what are you imagining the sideboard would actually look like? Give me an example implementation of how this would work.
Yep. So let's use past precedent. So I mean, Commander previously EDH as a format was 100 card singleton, right? It still is that, but it had a 10 card sideboard, sanctioned by Wizards of the Coast at one point. And that 10 card sideboard was used, as I've mentioned before, as a wish board for people. And we don't have wishes. We do have lessons in Pauper, which I think could have, if people chose to employ that, we could see Rakdos's first day of class combo used more often. We could see people who are without mana. There is one lesson I know that lets them find a basic land. So there are things that could be done if you're using lessons and learn mechanics. That really hasn't been explored a ton, but it would be possible in this strategy. But that's not the main reason why I'm recommending that we look at a sideboard. I think the main component of having a 10-card sideboard is having tools at your disposal, so that way you can alter your deck's removal suite, alter your deck's just overall answer board, I would say, or even just having alternate win conditions available.
So if I just stop you there a second. So what I was actually driving at is, you mentioned it'd be a 10-card sideboard. So let's say we start a game. What is the process? Do people announce what cards they're swapping in and out of their deck? Do they just get to do so if they see fit? How are you imagining this would be implemented? So what normally happens in the PDH game, of course, is that at some point the judge calls that the round has started. People may or may not still be taking their opening hands. And so in many cases, I find that the game is often 86 or 87 minutes as opposed to 90. How is this implemented? Do people have to announce that they're making the cuts, or do people just trust each other that they've taken or replaced certain cards in their deck?
This is going to sound like an old chestnut to say, but that we would go to the tournament organizers, the TOs, on how they would individually want to monitor that. But what I would say is that in that turn zero space where you're mulliganing, I think this would be, prior to mulligan, you would have, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes to sideboard, right? I mean, it would just depend on what amount of time allotment is reasonable. I don't have that number currently, but it would, again, go to the tournament organizers. I think that more than 5 minutes would delay tournament matches to an unhealthy degree, in my own perspective. Being able to do that, or to have it within the mulligan time frame, is the time that I'm looking at for potential sideboarding.
Okay, understood. I think, so in terms of opportunities for cheating, I've been trying to figure out how much of an issue this actually presents. In your view, basically, people would sideboard things, and they wouldn't have to reveal or declare which cuts they were making or changes they were making.
I mean, you have to register with any tournament now. You have to register your full list in sideboard, and so that would just be the extra 10 cards that would be listed as the sideboard component to it, to the list that's been submitted. So I don't think that it's going to be much of an issue there. You could sideboard and then count out your deck for, if that's going to be the process. So you could all see who the commanders are, and which seat position you're in, and then with that information, you can begin sideboarding. And
Sure.
then that stage is ended. Now let's begin for mulligans. That stage is ended.
You appreciate that in a digital space there is I'm not sure whether it's appreciably more of a risk than someone, as unfortunately in a recent tournament, having apparently a pile of cards off to the side. But there is some risk that if somebody has a sideboard off to the side, that they end up swapping things in and out of their hand surreptitiously.
Yeah, there is that component. I don't have an answer off the cuff to be able to fix that, but I would say that there would have to be something. There had to be something that the tournament organizers can do, and that would be a great brainstorm session for those TOs to come up with.
Okay,
and happy to be a part of that conversation if they wanted me there.
So one of my main criticisms would be that this would add an additional component of time onto the opening mulligans that I think would make the games even shorter and therefore be very unattractive if I have to not only individually declare which cuts and figure out which cuts I'm making, but then declare which cuts I'm making and go through my entire deck to find the relevant cards and replace them. But your view is that people would just chop and change them as they see fit at the start of the game.
That would be the only time they'd be able to.
Yeah. Okay, understood. So I see what you're saying.
How it's good.
Yeah. And so talk me again, I think you touched it already, but what is the incentive here is to give decks more creative freedom with how they solve for different pods at the table.
Yeah, and it takes a little more control and freedom to the pilot, more agency than just luck. I mean, somebody may have built a beautiful, beautiful build, but now, oh man, that pod, there's no way I could have won that game. We're having just absolute sour luck. And luck will always be a component of Magic. It will always be. I understand that, but it gives more of a fighting chance, more of a level playing field where it comes down to player decisions have a greater impact on the game than just the chance component of who your matchups are. And that's the driving force into bringing this in. It also adds a third or fourth dimension to how the game is played. Which I think is always adding intrigue. It's the same reason why they came up with new card types, Planeswalkers, why we have sagas now. WotC, R&D is always trying to find a new way to entice players to make the formats that they've created more interesting. And in my mind's eye, this adds another element to it beyond, adding dungeons in the initiative, adding its own element to the game. This would add an element to the game in the competitive sphere, at least, where players have agency to try and have a chance to tilt the scales in their favor, depending on what they put in that sideboard 10 list. So
okay, let me try and encapsulate why I think this is not a good idea in a way that I think is reflective of first of all, your enthusiasm, but also some of the points you've made. I have a couple of major objections. One of them was going to be the time it takes at the start of the game to resolve this, but let's put that aside for one time being, in addition to any considerations of potential for cheating. Okay, so there's a couple of major criticisms I have. The first one is that I think this incentivizes lazy deck building. And the reason I say that is that you could sit down and brew a deck that has a clear path for brewing the game, relevant tools that you carefully consider when you're including in the deck for dealing with different situations, different strengths and weaknesses that you accept and play around in that game. Or you could have an entire sideboard composed of every control piece you could think of needing, depending on what you think your deck can't handle. And I think that a lot of the beauty of the game and a lot of the strength of different decks is that players have taken the time to sit down and agonize over those last 3 cuts. I don't think that effectively turning the deck into a 110 card deck that you occasionally swap things in and out of is a very good thing. I think we'll see a lot of homogeneity in the sideboards. It'll mostly be there to hose certain decks.
And I think it ultimately incentivizes a lack of care taken. I think I'm not necessarily advocating that we start suddenly playing 90 card decks or 80 card decks as an extension of this idea. I think 100 cards is very neat and it's intriguing. But I do think that if, for example, your deck has a horrendous matchup against Hollow Marauder, and as a result, your sideboard is full of nothing but graveyard hate, I think it disincentivizes you from thinking about why you have a horrendous matchup against Hollow Marauder in the first place. And it actually takes away some of these more interesting components that I think also fall under what you call 4D chess, which is the discussions and thoughts you have at the start of a game and the decisions that you make. The second criticism I'd raise is, again, on that same point of tailoring to beat specific decks. We have actually a pretty decent meta right now, I think. When you and I joined the format, Adam, about a year and a half ago or whatever, I think there was a general sense of some sentiment of stagnation amongst certain entrenched players, that a lot of the meaningful fruit had been harvested and there wasn't necessarily a lot of new stuff to be discovered. There were some subjective assessments to adjust based on who was playing what deck, but that the meta was fairly entrenched. I don't necessarily think that's the case anymore. I don't just think it's the case that certain people play bad decks and then other people roll them. I think we actually have really good new emergent decks like Arabella, like Hollow Marauder, like Horrid Shadow Spinner, that have made a name for themselves in the meta and are worth talking about, are worth thinking about when you brew decks. I'm not saying we have to keep the meta the same way by any means, but I do think it's important that we try and encourage diversity. And I think there are some decks like Marauder that take advantage of a paucity of interaction of a certain nature in the space. And I think that the access to just a sideboard so that people can just run tech to remove Marauder basically removes that deck from the meta. I think that people being able to sideboard in cards like Witness Protection or Utter Insignificance to hose Dargo, to hose Arabella, these decks that, if they do run protection, it's not an enormous amount of it. People sideboarding in Oubliette just to screw over one particular player when they'd never normally justify the card for myriad reasons, I think ultimately is going to shrink the meta substantially. Because, moving to my third point, I think this is a criticism I raised with you a couple of times, which is that I think certain decks are much better able to take advantage of it than other decks. So your flagship deck is Mystic Enforcer, and you spend a lot of time in that deck filling the graveyard and rummaging about looking for certain pieces, which I think has served you very well. And I think you've done a lot better with the big Selesnya beat stick than people would otherwise have expected. It's 4/4 for 4 mana. It becomes a 6/6 with flying if you have Threshold, and it has protection from black. And I think you've proven that it can be very effective. But on account of your rummaging and digging about, you are better able to find some of the pieces you're teching in. Likewise, decks that can tutor effectively can also find cards they're teching in, whereas other decks that maybe are more interested in a consistent value proposition will not be able to. And I'm not necessarily saying that that's an innately bad thing, that decks that can tutor for pieces get ahead, but I do think it actually helps force the existing meta further towards the top. If Malcolm can go and find Echoing Truth at a whim, can run a copy of Echoing Truth, can run a copy of Fade Away, can bits and pieces that it wants to, and can tutor for those pieces convincingly, it makes it very hard for decks like Gut to exist in the meta. If, I don't know, decks like, Disciple of the Sea is already tutor.deck. If tutor.deck can suddenly go and find any piece that it knows it's specifically teched for to screw over the rest of the board, it can find a Drowning Sorrow, it can find an Evankar's Justice to wipe the board, it's going to place a restriction on the go-wide decks that can exist in the format. Likewise, if people, decks like creatures like Dargo that are very centralized on a particular commander that does a very particular thing, if people can find very cheap, easy interaction and fill their deck with it, run 10 extra pieces in over their conventional interaction suite, it makes it very hard for that player to win the game. Not to mention, I think that this ultimately encourages a very defensive meta, because I think most of what people will put in the sideboard are control/defensive pieces designed to shore up a weakness in their deck or deal with what they perceive to be a problem at the pod. And I think that will almost invariably come at the expense of whatever it was they were going to do in order to try and win the game in the first place. So I think we'll see a lot more draws if this is a thing. I also think we'll see a shrinking of the meta where certain decks will float to the top. And I also think we're going to see a lot more sloppy, unoptimized piles because people will just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, I can just sideboard that in. So that's how I'll let you go walk through that, and I'm happy to articulate any of those points again individually if you'd like me to.
I think that you're right. There will be more interaction that is present. Is what I would expect. However, I don't believe you still have to find those pieces. I don't believe it's going to have as much of a detrimental impact as you've stated. because there's still only 100 cards that you're playing with. And so it might add, a 5, maybe 8% chance of drawing interaction, right? In each deck. So, but it increases one's odds, but I don't believe that it will get to a point where the meta will become polluted to the point. And I don't think that the meta becoming polluted, I don't think that has anything to do with whether or not a sideboard exists. I think that people have just found better ways to innovate. And
so, but you appreciate on this point though that if someone has, for example, a muddle or mixture in hand, they have another functional copy of a large number of other copies of cards in their list, right? So whereas you might sideboard in, I don't know, I'm trying to think what you play in Selesnya that might be useful.
It's Selesnya, nothing's useful.
I'm trying to think. Let's say that you run a copy of Congregate, right? So Muddle's a bad example, but let's say I have Dimir Houseguard. You have one functional copy of Congregate that you might find, but if I've got Dimir Houseguard, I have two. Likewise, if you run, I don't know, Gary in a black deck, but I'm also running a black deck, but I have a Disciple of the Sea, I suddenly have like 5 functional copies of Gary. And so different decks are going to benefit from this massively asymmetrically. And I'm not necessarily saying that you'll end up with a more stale meta one way or the other. My suspicion is that it won't just be the case that the meta shifts. I think it will contract. I think that we will see certain decks that rely on just having a value proposition will become less relevant. I also think that if someone's really worried about, for example, a Hollow Marauder, it's not just the case that they're slightly more likely to find Graveyard Hate. If they sub in 10 cards of Graveyard Hate, they're going to find it at some point. And if their deck is capable of winning outside of that, they're going to likely be more than happy to do that. And so I do think that whether this proves effective or not, I think it will make it very difficult for certain decks to exist in the meta. And I'm not sure that's something we want to occur.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I look to other formats where they have a 1v1 setting with 15 card sideboards. It doesn't. I don't think that metas are destroyed by sideboards. I can't see the argument being valid. I'm trying. I really am, because I'm hearing your point, but there's so much past precedent in other formats where it doesn't happen.
I understand that, but I think my criticism would be that most of the best decks in our meta currently already have access to plenty of tutors, and we would expect then that they would be asymmetrically benefited by doing what you discussed. I don't think, for example, it's the case that you having access to a sideboard is going to give you better odds against Gretchen. I think it's going to give Gretchen significantly better odds against you, because they're going to be able to go and find the utter insignificance. They're going to be able to find the echoing truths to bounce your auras off you, etc., much more effectively than you can. Whatever land destruction, etc., or land hate piece you're running, or enchantment hate piece, your acidic moss or whatever it's called, it's statistically much more likely that they will find whatever it is they want to screw you over than the other way around. And again, my principal criticism is again that I think that this will slow games down substantially. I think that people will make cuts in such a way, or adjustments in such a way, that they are less able to enact their own win condition, unless they're a deck that goes so fast anyway that they're probably going to win the game. And so I think we will see more draws in a format that is already struggling with an abnormally high number of draws.
Perhaps. I think the best way to find out is to have. I truly, I mean, this is a call to action to anybody who is running tournaments moving forward. Is let's find out. Let's actually see. Let's have a couple of tournaments where it's allowed. There was one tournament in Rule Break Month where they had Planeswalkers available in the zone. I think that needed to just be a standard, because I thought that brought, spicier interaction. It also, Planeswalkers in the zone were at a disadvantage in my mind against creatures in the zone because combat damage didn't exist. Commander damage didn't exist in those strategies. Being able to find out whether or not it does end up creating longer games. I don't think that adding more interaction into a pod will just automatically cause longer games to happen, because players have to make the decision to use them at certain points. It has to be piloted through. There's theory, and then there's the actual result. And so, but you bring up some awesome points, Ben, and I see the perspective. I'm curious with the listeners what you all think. I mean, if you put in the comments, we did talk about turn 0. We talked about a lot of those pieces. I'm very curious to hear about your theories, your concepts on what information is shared between players in the beginning. If you have perspective, if it was a total waste of your time, tell us.
We don't care if it's a total waste of time either way. We're going to sit here and yap, and people can listen.
We're going to
yap
away, right? Right.
But we're here to make content, not to make good content.
Yeah. And then if the sideboarding is something that would be encouraged or not. I mean, I think that it's good to have more elements to the game overall, which I think makes it more intriguing. And that was the primary push. But we'll see if it trends or not. I think that'll be interesting.
I agree.
Interesting take.
I'd definitely be keen to give this a go. I think it's definitely suitable for casual games. Initially, I think there is the question of how much popularity something has to have. I mean, this would be quite a substantial change to the way we play the format, and so there'd have to be significant incentive for it. What do you think would be the impetus? What would get everybody rally behind this and make people want to do it? Because you clearly have your own. You think this would be interesting. I'm sure you have in mind some ideas of what you'd put in your own sideboard, which we can explore. But what do you think would have to happen for there to be a big wave of people saying, yes, let's do this. This is good for the health of the format.
I think if there are decks that continue to bubble up to the top that are just difficult to surmount, right? And I think that if you're seeing decks like Laylor and Gretchen sweep over and over and over as the champions of the format that can't necessarily be stopped, but when you see that, or even Abdel, even before then, Abdel was blue for a long time, was before us even was crushing it. When you see those insurmountable meta decks, then that's where, okay, what is my deck's weakness and how do I circumvent that in these situations? And so that's where I see universality of how a sideboard could be helpful for people. Oh, jeez.
That's funny. I meant to unmute myself and I managed to stop the recording. I think that it's definitely interesting. You made a very strong case for it. So I think we're happy to probably wrap the episode up around there. But if we do a quick recap, so we had a quick conversation about pilots and their reputations at the table and how you might think about where you leverage your political power, who's more likely to be interested, what the body language and the tone of people at the table is like. We had a discussion about seat position. So we talked about what you can do in different positions when you think you're going to invest more, who you take more seriously based on where they are. Adam, you brought this really interesting point about colors and how they could be a useful heuristic if you really don't know what they're looking at and the kind of cards you might be looking out for. And then we had a discussion about different strengths and weaknesses and who sees who's the threat at the table. We had a brief discussion about mulligans and how aggressively you mulligan and what you're looking for. And we finished all of this with a conversation about the sideboard. So was there anything else that you'd like to touch on, Adam, that we might have missed before we wrap this up?
No, I think it was a good talk. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through it with me. And the whole turn zero concept, it's quick. I mean, it's usually about 5, maybe 10 minutes of the entire game. So there's a lot to expand on here. And being able to add in the comments, I'm just going to ask everybody, what did you think? I mean, what do you think about in your turn zero experience? What do you look for? What are some things that have been helpful to you in turn zero? Let us know in the comments. And if in that sideboard idea, let us know what your thoughts are on that. We'd love to hear from you.
100%. So thanks everybody for listening. I've been Ben, factz.vibes. It's my good friend Adam, Beachbard God. Until next time, you guys take care.
Cheers, everybody.